list. They interviewed all the Holocaust survivors in Michigan, all over the United States of America. And her video's in the museum, and you can always Google her if you want to see her video. So on this one, as I was looking at it, I decided to play 1 minute. And she tells you what she wants the world to know. And I thought that was very important. So let's start her. This is my mom, Viola.
We didn't fight the Germans and the Hungarians.
Okay, I think we got to start a little behind.
How could you fight?
Okay, let's start
We
behind
were
about what she
scared.
feels.
In each village, just a few. And then we didn't have any.
Okay, now it's at 1 hour, 7 minutes.
All religions are good. Everybody believes in one God.
It's hard because it's small numbers
it's
and I
okay.
can't see them all.
We can get to
But I guess they are brought up like that from their families.
They're talking
I
about
can't
like
help it.
white supremacists and stuff. So they asked her.
Do you think that there are any ways that what you experienced as a child impacts your life today?
Sure it does. You never had a real childhood. You were never a teenager. You never went on a date like teenagers do too. You had to grow up right away. And what you went through in Auschwitz and in Bergen-Belsen, what you've seen, it lives with you. But I was lucky. I got a good husband. I got wonderful children.
Wait.
All of
David,
them went to college. I worked
1 hour,
on
7
hard.
minutes.
They
This is
should
it.
go to college.
Okay. I want you to
And
hear
they
what
were
she
smart
said, what
kids.
she wants the world
My
to
son
know.
is
Is at
an
1 hour and 7
attorney.
minutes.
My daughter is an attorney.
Okay, let's go. We don't need to hear her brag.
They gave her a scholarship.
Okay, way back. Now she's talking about my daughter.
We pause here.
Hard to
Okay,
do
this is at 1 hour, 7 minutes right here. No, this isn't it.
Okay.
Back further.
Well,
That's my
See,
dad.
it's hard to do. This little dot here is like, oh, 1-7, 1-7. Okay, so
Okay.
20 seconds.
Rotary Club and I don't know what sent money in her honor to the schools here, but yeah. So I have nice children and grandchildren.
Okay, is there anything you would like to add or anything you'd like to say at this time?
Yes, I get very upset when I hear that we were cowards, that we didn't fight the Germans and the Hungarians and so. How could you fight? We were scattered, in each village just a few. And then we didn't have any rifles or any guns or anything. We didn't have anything. And the young men they took to labor camps a year before us. So who was there to fight? Children and
Just
old
like in Ukraine,
people
just
without
women and kids.
anything? My grandma stood up to them, so what did she get? Nothing.
Get killed.
And that's what upsets me, really. That's how could people think that we just went like cattle to the slaughterhouse. We didn't. We had no choice. Nobody wanted to help us.
Okay, I just wanted to start with this because I thought it kind of reminds me of Ukraine. And all the men were taken away. My dad was taken away in 1941. He tried to work, and in 1941, they couldn't go to school. You know, they got their Stars of David on them. They couldn't work anymore, and they couldn't go to school anymore. And so what was left? The women and the children, just like they are today. And one of the things that my mother told me, and I was watching her video and I refreshed my memory, that the day that they were taken to the ghetto before they went to Auschwitz, there was a loudspeaker. And the loudspeaker said, everybody pack your bags and you have to be downstairs by a certain time. So they all packed their bags, and her grandma, who lived with them, said, I'm not going. And her father said to the grandmother, you don't have a choice. And she goes, this is my home. And this is how the people in Ukraine, who wants to leave their home? This is their life. Centuries of family had lived in that home. So, so they got gathered and they went to, by cattle train, of course, they went to a ghetto. and the ghetto was in the Czech Republic, in Czech and Slovakia. And at the ghetto, they spent, how many days? I wrote it down. They spent 3 weeks at the ghetto. And she was with her parents, her sisters. There were 4 girls in the family, so she was with 2 of her sisters. One of her sisters got killed in one of the mass graves in Lublin, Poland. And who else was with her? And Grandma was there. Grandma got it because she was not being cooperative, but they were all there. And she told me that when you were in this ghetto, it was like being in a barn. They were on a cement floor for 3 weeks. There was no place to sleep. They hardly fed them, and they stayed there. And then they rounded them up from the ghetto, and they took them by cattle train to Auschwitz. And one of the other things she told me, it's interesting, in the village she lived in, she was in a prominent family. They were fairly well off. Her father was the builder of the community, and there were only 3 Jewish families in this whole village, in this whole community. And she went to Russian Orthodox schools. She went to all the Orthodox schools, and it was, she said she never had anti-Semitism until the Hungarians rounded them up first. And the Hungarians in 1941 sent my dad to prison for trying to work, and he was in a jail from 1941 to 44. In 1944, he got out and he went home, and guess what? His family was already gone. And then they sent him to a work camp. And so for my mother, when this first happened and she couldn't go to school, the kids said to her, "You killed Jesus." And she goes, "I didn't kill Jesus." And they go, "Yes, you did." And they said, "Then if you didn't kill Jesus, your parents killed Jesus." So she goes to her father and she says, "Dad, why did you kill Jesus?" And he said, "I didn't kill Jesus." And so he tried to explain it to her. And that was the only anti-Semitism she experienced, because I think the families must have said, they're rounding up our Jewish neighbors because they killed Jesus, or something like that. And then when she got to Auschwitz, she said it was, they were in a train for 3 days, and she said when they arrived at Auschwitz, there were all these well-dressed people. So it was like the propaganda. It made you think you're going to a good place. What did they know? But then the stench, the smelling, and the fires in the background, and the odor, you knew something was wrong. And then when she got out, she said they just marched her, and they turned her in a certain way toward where Mengele is. And her mother, father, Grandma was already done with, and her 2 sisters, and she had 2 nieces with the 2 sisters. They were all sent to the other line. So my mother just kind of marched, and all of a sudden she realized they're gone. She never saw them again. And then when she got to the barracks after Mengele, they shaved their hair, took off all their hair. They gave them gray and white striped uniform to wear, and they let them shower. And that was her first night there. And then when she goes to her barrack at Auschwitz, she was in A1, she told me, they piled 10 people on top of each other. You were just piled up on top of each other. And she said that at night, if somebody had to use the bathroom, the latrines, there were like holes in the floor, they gave you a bucket near the barrack. And they had to go in the bucket, and the last person to go had to empty the bucket. And that's what they did there. And then, then after about 5 weeks, she was very lucky. They transported her to Hamburg. They took her away from Auschwitz. And when she went to Hamburg, she did construction. She built houses. They worked them. They were like slave laborers. And she was there for a while. And then the factory got bombed. And when the factory got bombed, she said some of her girlfriends were killed. And then they sent them to Uzhishort or some other name. And then they worked there. And she said they were only fed once a day. They had soup and stale bread, and that was it. And that's what they lived in. And she thinks that they drugged them, because the girls never had a period, but I think they never got a period because they were emaciated. But she always felt that she was drugged. So then, after she left the second work camp, before she went to the second work camp, she was going to a job with friends, and they were on like a streetcar, and there were like 3 streetcars, and it was a very windy day, and she was in the first streetcar, and she had this premonition. She said to her girlfriends, there was always 5, they were always traveling in numbers that stuck together. A lot of people were with sisters or family. She didn't have any, they were already gone, so she was with friends, and they're in this streetcar, and she all of a sudden got this horrible feeling on the inside, and she said to her friends, we don't want to be here. And they said, they'll kill us if they see. My mother said, no, let's go. And she grabbed them, and they went to the 3rd streetcar. And in 5 minutes, the wind blew a brick wall, and they were all killed in the first 2 streetcars. And she lived. There were, what did she say, 200, and about 30 lived. And these were all just women. They were all killed. So then they went on, and then they went to Bergen-Belsen. And when they got to Bergen-Belsen, she said, and here's where I'm going to play my next video, because I want to explain what she says at Bergen-Belsen. First of all, she says you walk in and you see people's shoes and clothes. You see everything all over. So she and her friends said, this is it. They brought us here to kill us. And David, I think
Yes,
we're
dear.
at 12 minutes, okay? But I want you to hear from her own words what she and the girls said to each other when they arrived at Bergen-Belsen.
Shoot you all if we lose the war or anything. And we heard shooting, and we said, oh, they're taking us to kill us all. And we were hugging each other and saying goodbye to each other in those trains. And it was just awful. We were about 3 days in those trains. The trains couldn't move because the English were so close nearly. And it was almost the end of the war. It was only a couple
March
months before the
1944.
war ended. And then one day was a little more quiet, and they got us out from the train, and we started walking. When we were walking, we saw shoes and jackets and things, and we said, oh, they're taking to shoot us someplace. See, the people dropped everything, and they're going to kill us there. And we come into Bergen-Belsen, and big piles of dead bodies on both sides, big piles of them. And we just walked slowly, and they took us to barracks. And in the barracks, lots of people were sick and so on, dying, typhoid fever they had. And I had my father's cousin or something was working in a kitchen of a cousin's daughter. And she took me that I should give food. What food was it? Some crummy soup I should serve. But there were very few who could eat yet. And I come to one, some of them didn't even pick up their heads to take their food or anything. And I come to one of those things there, and a young girl just couldn't put down, everybody was just laying around her, didn't even pick up their heads. And she was crying and crying to swallow. And it impressed me so much that nobody even is trying, and she's trying so hard to swallow that soup. I said, where from are you? She said, from Holland. And I didn't know what I didn't know why. Even I survived lice all over and terrible conditions in Bergen-Belsen, just bodies all over laying. And when I came to the United States and I saw pictures from Anna Frank, I realized it was her. And everybody just was laying around her, nobody even picked up their heads. And we got liberated April 15, 1945. The English liberated us. But everybody had typhoid fever there. I was lucky that I got a typhoid fever after I was liberated. Because otherwise I could have never survived. And the English took me to the hospital, I didn't know how long I was there because the fevers were so high that I was like comatose. I didn't know what was going on with me. And all of a sudden, like in May, I hear shootings. And the girls, the nurses in the hospital, oh, we are all free, we are free. And I looked at them, was it there? They said, Hitler is there, the war is over, and you are free to do what you want to. So I was free, and I was in the hospital. And after the typhoid, I ate so much, they used to say, you are so little, where do you put all this stuff?
All right, we'll stop here. All right. One of the things about when she was in the camp, how did she make it? How did she keep going? She was in survival mode, and she described survival mode as being like a zombie. You know, you just exist and you just go and you just numb yourself out. But after the war, she went to Prague and she took a train back to her village because she was hoping, she knew nobody was going to be alive, but she was hoping, maybe I'll see a sister. And of course, there was no sister there. And when she did come to America, she went through New York and then she saw the Statue of Liberty, and she said that was the happiest day of her life, to see the Statue of Liberty. And she had an uncle. Her uncle came to America with her father. Her father was an American citizen, but went back to Czechoslovakia. And her uncle was the president in Squirrel Hill, Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, of the synagogue that was attacked. Remember that synagogue in Squirrel Hill? Her uncle was the president of that synagogue. It's just how things come back. And what I was telling the ladies before is the Russians. My mother said about the Russians, when people were coming back from war and the Russians there, a lot of them she said, you can't trust the Russians. They sent people to Siberia. We know Raoul Wallenberg, who saved all these Jews, was sent to Siberia. And I think, I guess I got about 2 more minutes. But the thing that I found out from both my parents was how bad the Hungarians were. When my mother would speak with her friends, she belonged to a Hungarian club and she talked Hungarian, my father couldn't take it. He had to go to another room because he spent from 1941 to 1944 in a prison in Hungary for trying to work as a Jew. So he couldn't tolerate anything Hungarian. And I'll tell you, he did have his revenge. He went to Budapest and he went on a train, and while he was on the train, there were all these Eurocross, Hungarian Nazis, and he took his boys and he says, let's get them. And they attacked these men, threw them off the train, got all of their money, and then they took there were 200 women that they took for dinner, but he said that was the best day of his life, was getting those Hungarian Nazis.
Yay.
And he talks about it on his video. Okay.
Alrighty, thank you.
I just want to get into this before we start. So, is this your? Is
I didn't know I was gonna do tech consulting tonight, so that's not part of the deal. No, we're century 24. So now you put it
What was the end of after the word?
in 24.
Okay.
Okay. As you know, we're well organized typically.
Well, we're timing each other. I'll time you
So,
now.
okay. All right, I'm going to start from a little different perspective. One of the things that, as I was getting the information together, I asked myself, why did so many Jews settle in Poland and in Germany before the war? We can have audience participation. Any guesses? Anybody have an idea? Why were they there? Anybody know why they were there?
They were born there.
It was what?
They were born there.
They were born there. Why were they born there? Because their parents were there. And we asked the question, why were their parents there? Well, what happened to many of the Jews during the pogroms in Russia and in other countries, they were thrown out of the country. In Poland, between 1690 and thereafter, until prior to World War II, they were very friendly, as was Germany, in accepting the Jewish population, and they really flourished in most of these places for 2 reasons. One is they tended to bring a lot of culture and different kinds of creative components to these countries. And secondly, they were very good at trading. They were, excellent at bringing in commerce and a whole bunch of other things. And so most of the countries, Poland and Germany, Amsterdam, some of the other countries accepted the Jewish population because they brought a lot of help to the local population. And you can see that happen also prior to World War II. I walked with a gentleman in the morning who was in Germany right before the war, ended up going to Shanghai right before World War II started, and ended up, they started with, actually they had a lot of Jewish people that went there, and many of them were Orthodox. They started religious schools, they started stores and banks and everything else. And the Chinese people really appreciated that until Japan got in the war, and then Japan said, no, you can't have it. So they were there for about 6 years and provided a lot of culture in there. So that's one of the things I think that's very important, that to understand that many of the Jews settled in Poland, because even though they turned out to be, and they were split and they were divided, different countries took them over, but they brought a certain type of atmosphere to many of these countries that was very, very positive. And very helpful to them. So when the Nazis set their sights on Poland right before World War II, they sought to destroy all that was there and to build it up against the colonial homeland for Germany. So they became colonists, and they wanted to just get all of the European countries together and say, we're going to be part of it, which is what they tried to do, and they were pretty close to being successful. So with this background, I want to tell you the story of my mother. She was born in College, Poland, and I want to thank Sally for this map because it helped me look at it from a big picture. She really did a nice job, and she helped me plan it. So she started in college right here, went to a place called, and we have to be careful how we pronounce this, but Stunske Vola. And as I mentioned in my previous presentation, I went with my mother in 1995, where she was taking kids to, high school kids, to all of these places where she was at. She ended up in Stunske Vola, which became a ghetto, and I'll explain it a little bit more. So then she went to the Lodz ghetto. She ended up in Auschwitz, and then they marched her and they took her in cattle cars. And by the way, if you want to see a cattle car, there's one at the Holocaust Memorial Center. They have a remnant of a cattle car that they rescued and brought it there to Stutthof, and then to Praus, and then there was the March of Death up here, where they wanted to march them into the Baltic Sea. And I have to thank Sally for doing a fabulous job on the drawing. It gave me also, yeah, let's give her a round of applause. Thank you, Sally. And she probably knows more about this than I do, because she helped me develop the presentation, so I do want to thank her a lot for that. So anyway, so she was born in College, Poland. My grandmother and grandfather on my mother's side had 3 children, 2 boys and 1 girl, Yosef, and again, it's all Hebrew names, so in English would probably be Joseph. The oldest was the oldest, my mother was the middle child, and Aaron was the youngest.
I'm sorry, are you familiar with Pinsk?
Pinsk?
Poland?
Yeah.
Poland?
Yes.
That's where my grandparents are from. And
Okay.
I'm actually the president of the Pinskers,
Oh.
which is all the people that came from Pinsk.
Pinsk, right.
an organization.
Well, in the old days, what they used to name it after a chief rabbi that was in there. So like you have the Pinsker rabbi, or you have, like, my father was from Galicia, so it was the Galicianer rabbi. So they converted it to Jewish, and that's the way this stuff came out. So each state in Poland had a chief rabbi, and that individual was responsible for the whole community in terms of, keeping kosher, all of the Jewish laws and everything else. So they named people after that. So that's why you have the Lubavitch are also from a place called Lubavitch in Poland. So they're all related to it. I assume people know a little bit about the Lubavitch. But anyway, so Aaron was the youngest child. So it was Yosef, my mother Gita, or Genia as they say in Polish, and then Aaron. And in December of 1939, when they were still in college, they became very fearful, and so they decided to go from college to Stunske Vola, which was much safer. And they ended up in Stunske Vola, is where my mother's mother was born, and that's where she grew up. My grandmother grew up. And what they ended up doing is they were fine for a little bit, and then right when the beginning of the Nazi invasion, they put them into a ghetto, and they had like 3 streets for them, 3 main streets with homes, and they had to live in a room that was probably the size of our bathroom, where they had families living in there. So imagine living in Sylvan Lake and just living on Garland Street for the whole community, and then you have to share that with, you know, other families and everybody else. So, you know, it was pretty difficult. Now I want to just show you how my mother described her, the way she ended up in Stunskivola. I thought my mouse disappeared.
Because the war just broke out at the time when I was your age, and I had so much hope and you know, for the future and education. I went through five and a half years of ghettos, concentration camps, labor camps, the March of Death for 3 months, including Auschwitz. Before the war, you know, in your age, I had a very comfortable life. I had 2 brothers. I did attend a very strict Catholic school because my parents always want us to mingle with other people. And I had friends from all walks of life, though, really. Catholic, Jewish, German, because I come from a 33,000 Jewish population. In 1939, when the war broke out, we were the first one from Poland to be driven out from our home. I, my 2 brothers, my parents, walked because we didn't want to be sent by trucks to somewhere to the east. So my mother was born in a little town about 50 kilometers from my hometown Kalisz. And we walked 50 kilometers to reach this town. Because this town at that time was still intact. The people were partially living free, but at that time they had already the white armbands, and then they gave us the Star of David. It didn't take too long when when there were about 8,000 people in this little town, when we were concentrated in 3 streets, and when it was a ghetto, I mean a ghetto, we were surrounded by wires. We was rationed, food was rationed, and there were curfews. At curfews, we couldn't go out after 5 o'clock. I lost my whole extended family. I lost my name, I lost my home, and I had no friends left, none of them, not even one. Being there in this ghetto, there were roundups, every day there were roundups. They took out young people and they sent them somewhere nobody knew where they're going, but one thing we knew in the ghetto, that they were digging ditches. And at that time, who could even think of it? That people were digging ditches for other people to be buried. Life in the ghetto, in this ghetto, was simply unbearable. Because every morning they came in by trucks, the German guards, they came in by trucks and they took out children and all the people they took out. And they went where they was digging those ditches. That was a death camp called Helmno. They put them in those buses. Those buses had no windows. They were black buses. There were no air. We could see there were no windows, no openings. The buses were completely covered. So what did they do? They poured some gas in, and people were gassed in those buses. Being there in this little town for over 2 years, one morning we had trucks, we had shots, shouting, the German Nazis were shouting, everybody had to leave their homes and stay in front of the house. You know, I didn't sleep in a bed for 5.5 years because we had a little room, so I always slept, I was the one that slept on the floor always. People that concentrated, 8,000 people, it was not so easy to concentrate from the whole ghetto. And we were leading towards the Jewish cemetery. I never knew this Jewish cemetery. They were marching toward, you know, it was in September of 1942. The heat was unbearable. I mean, we couldn't carry anything. We put some warm clothes because the winter was, the fall and the winter was coming pretty soon. And we couldn't even wear that, how hot it was. When we came to this cemetery, before we got into the cemetery, there were those big gates, and there were German guards on both sides. So what did they do? There was a selection. The people to the right were the people for death, and the people to the left are the people who were supposed to live. My little brother, who was at that time 12 years old, was sent to the side of death. And we were just facing each other because the cemetery was not that big, so we were facing each other. And my brother was crying and stretching his hands to us. It got a little dark. My father was very upset. My parents were crying. How can we save them to get them on the side of life? So my father walked out and he tried to reach my brother on the other side. And he was surrounded then with German guards. And they shot him on very close range. They shot him. My father fell to the ground. He was laying in a pool of blood. And he couldn't save my brother though. My brother, and my mother, they put us again on trucks. The other people naturally they sent to Helmno, where all those ditches were digged for them. And what did they do? The people they couldn't kill everybody because it was only 10%. 10% left. We talk about 7,000 people. So what do? The people had to run towards those ditches, and the German were shooting after them. And whoever fell in was shot was lucky because the people were buried alive, because a lot of people did not get shot. And they fell in those ditches and they were buried alive.
That was one of the experiences, again, that she talked about extensively, even after, even when she came home. And when she used to do a presentation on some of these issues, she would come home and she'd have these terrible headaches and she'd have these nightmares, and she talks a little bit more about that. After this, Chelmno and Stunskivola, they were taken to the Lodz ghetto in cattle cars. As I mentioned previously, there is an example of a cattle car at the Holocaust Center on Orchard Lake Road. And in those cattle cars, when they were transferred, they found that most of the people did not make it because, first of all, there's no oxygen. I mean, the air was very thin, and they were crowded. I mean, imagine putting 100 people on a cattle car that, might fit 25 people, even at that. And they ended up, many people died on the way to the Lodz ghetto, and they walked over bodies. They didn't have a choice because they couldn't get out, and they were stuck in the cattle car for so many weeks and months. So, and it was very difficult. So once they got to the Lodz ghetto, again, the rations were very minimal, and as Fran mentioned, you either got water, and maybe if you're lucky, you got a piece of bread. And they did
soup and bread.
Soup and bread. Well, they got water and bread, and actually they got water. She said they got water and grass, which at that time was still, something that they could eat. But many of them didn't have any food. And I think she mentions later on where she weighed 60 pounds when she was going through all of this. You could see her bones and everything else.
How old was she? Yeah.
She was 12. Actually, when she left I take it back. When she left Stunskivola, she was 14. It was 2 years later. But like she started the speech by saying, "I never had your childhood," and it's interesting when she first started talking to my kids, her grandkids. She really didn't tell anybody anything until she saw their kids, and she started explaining to the kids what happened to her. And the kids had a nice room and had a bed and everything. And my mother said to me, "I never had a bed like this. I never had a room. I slept on concrete, or actually on dirt, and she went to camps and everything else."
What year was she born?
1925. Yeah. Well, that's what she says she was, but nobody gave their real birthday, and nobody could remember the real birthday. I know with my father, we said he was 83, he was born earlier, and he was born later. I mean, it's just, nobody really knew their real birthday. They all forgot, because remember, they were young and didn't have parents, there were a lot of orphans. And one of the things that a lot of people don't realize, in the ghettos, there were over 1.5 million children that were killed. And there's a place in Israel called Yad Vashem, which is a remembrance, and they but they identify 1.5 million kids that were murdered. Like she was telling about her brother, who was younger than her. They just said, you're going to the side of life or you're going to the side of death. I mean, it was just unbelievable. So anyway, so her older brother became very ill, and I'm not going to play that part because that's, I think, a little bit more difficult to bear tonight. But it's her brother just didn't get enough food, and they tried to give him more food and everything else, and she talks about how he died of starvation in her arms. So I haven't seen these videos in a long time, and she died about 1.5 years ago, so it was like really difficult to watch the whole thing. She was then transported to Auschwitz-Birkenau, and then she described her first encounter with the concentration camp. And I want to share this with you because I think, as Fran mentioned, this is the same thing with Mengele.
The flames from the crematoriums, and the smell of human flesh was simply unbearable. There too, they were shouting, "Get passed out from those cattle cars, leave everything behind you." People were jumping because there were little heights, so people were jumping down from those cattle cars. There must be about 1,000 people there, because there were 10 cattle cars, maybe 10. It was close to 1,000 people. We were marching towards the crematorium. The flames was simply, you look at the flames, you thought you're right in it. And there were so many people ahead of me and my mother that they cut this transport in half. The first 500 people went into the crematorium, and the other 500 people went to our selection. I and my mother was in the other half of the 500 people. So we went through the selection. We went through Dr. Mengele. Dr. Mengele was the biggest sadist you could ever imagine. Everybody had to go through. We stand in front of him completely nude. All our clothes was off. At that time I had only my mother. I didn't want to lose her. So every time I pushed her ahead of me, when it came my time to go through him, then I made faces to him that he shouldn't concentrate on my mother. My mother was only 42 years old, but at that time they were old. A person was old, that he shouldn't concentrate on me. So I made faces, I smiled at him, I don't know what I did. He put his hand on my shoulder, he put his hand, and he looked at me. In the meantime, my mother went on the side of life. Because there were always, the left and right, always. People for death, people for life. My mother went through to be alive. Many people from the 500 went to the crematoriums because it were older people too. What did they do? They shaved our hair. I was completely shaved off our hair. They gave us the striped uniforms. I did not have a tattoo, only because we were in a quarantine. There were about 200 people in this one barrack in Auschwitz, and we were in a quarantine that any time they will have time for us, they can always send us to the crematorium. That's the reason they didn't even want to waste. So what did they do? They gave us, I was registered there. They gave us numbers with a piece of fabric on it, written the number. 2 numbers, 3 numbers actually. I remember in my life though. And there were the numbers of me, my mother, and my social security number. So my number was 88,911. I never lost this number in my mind because I had a piece of fabric with my number here. Being there in this barrack and waiting to die again, I had 2 friends who I came together from the Lodz ghetto. We were very close because they were one of my best friends. And we were together in the same barrack. There were bunk beds. There were 12 people in one bunk bed, 6 on one side and 6 on the other side. And we had to fit in to each other because we couldn't even move around. There were appeals every morning, 5 o'clock. Appeals that they had to count us. We had to leave, and it was already very cold outside. We had to stay there in the front of the building. We had to, in front of the barrack, we had to stay there and be counted. Twice a day we were counted. So one day, I just felt very loose. I could move around in my bed because I was with my friends in my bunk bed. My friends were right next to me. I said, where are they? So they went out. They couldn't take it anymore. They went and they touched those electric wires. And when we went out to be counted, I saw my 2 friends hanging on those electric wires. They couldn't take it anymore. A day before, they didn't say a word, both of them. They were talking only to each other. They were about 17 years old. They were talking to each other, to us. They didn't say a word to me, and my mother didn't say a word. Once you touch those electric wires, you get electrocuted immediately. You get a new hand on it. And my 2 friends.
Anyway, I have about 60 seconds left. I don't know how fast I can talk.
Maybe that give Marcia.
Then Marcia will come up and do her part. Let me share with you the happy ending so that we get away from this. We ended up, my mother ended up having typhoid when she left, when she was rescued by, the Russians came through, and she ended up going through the March of Death, and they ended up escaping with her mother, and she ended up having typhoid, and then she was in it used to be called a sanatorium, but it was a hospital for about 2 months. And then she came out and ended up going to what we call a DP camp. Where's the gentleman in Ansbach? Back there.
Yeah.
Ziggy, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You were in there.
Yeah, we were both at the same place, so ended up getting married. I was born in a DP camp, and as I mentioned about that stuff last.
In the DP camp?
Yeah, Ansbach, yeah.
So was my brother.
Yeah. So was Kissinger,
Yeah.
and he's
a lot
still
of-
alive, which is nice. So he, so anyway, and then after I was born, my mother found out that she had TB, and she had to go to the hospital, and at that time there was no cure for TB, so she ended up staying in the hospital for 2 years. And I don't know if this is true now, but she told me that they would give her like 6 raw eggs every day to help out because of the protein. Is that?
Yes, that's true.
Okay.
My mother had TB, they did that.
They did it right. Every day, 6 raw eggs. Phew. I don't know if I could take 1, let alone 6. So
You do what you have to do to live.
they did exactly. So
Need to get
anyway,
burned.
she managed to survive, and at that time, in order to come to the United States, you had to have a sponsor. My grandparents had already come here. They found a sponsor. I was 11 years old. I went to schools in Germany, which I told you about previously, but some of you have heard about it. And we came here, and then in 1957 we moved to Cleveland, where the rest of my family lived. My grandparents were there, my great aunt and uncle. They had gone to Russia right before World War II, so they managed to survive. Some of the family made it. My grandmother's brothers and sisters, some went to Israel, at that time Palestine, and managed to survive. Most of my all of my father's family was
I'm
killed,
gonna stop you.
and that's it.
Okay, Marcia, come on.
Thank you.
So.
Thank you. Something you can talk about forever.
Yeah,
Oh,
after
yeah.
I realized there's so much I left out, but,
Yeah.
you just go on
Maybe
and
there'll
on
be a
and on.
salon for.
Yes.
Sure.
And then I just, I don't know, this will come on to there.
Yeah, sure. Do you have, what do you have, HDMI or?
Well, I didn't bring it.
Well, we have an adapter.
Yeah.
Just plug it in there and then I can put the HDMI in there.
Okay, what, just put this.
Yeah. That's on that
Over
phone.
here. No, you know what, you're not working.
Oh.
I don't think I
Yeah.
have the right, Try-
Let me see
try
the
just
other
that
side.
one.
Well, that's not gonna work because it's an HDMI cable. No?
If not, that's okay. I think I'll just.
Sure.
No,
That's it.
everybody did.
Okay.
My parents would put that.
Can you make it louder?
Yeah, but
Let me just plug it in. The plug's over there. Sure.
Spanish too. Yeah, and it's a big art community and, it's people calling me people, over 60,000 kids, whatever, 50,000.
okay. I am going to give a little different spin because I think that a couple different things, and I as David was saying, when you go through and you listen to the tapes, well, let me back up a little bit. So I'm Marcia Billis, and I'm just going to show you a picture of, this is of course as time went by, but this was my dad, Jack Wayne, when he came to the States. And then there was a book that was done by Marnie, who was in our neighborhood, who's a photographer. So she put this beautiful book together called Living Witnesses. And so again, it's just kind of nice to put a face with the story, but I just want to show you.
Marcia, can you hold it up a little bit?
Yeah, so this is my dad and his brother, but you see, they're not people, they were the numbers. So you can see on their arms that, just as David's mom said, that they had these, that's who they became, and the numbers were also on these striped uniforms. And then this is a picture of my dad's brother. So this was Larry, Jack and Larry. And then my aunt, who Fran actually knows, my cousin, my aunt's on one of the other videos. So what happened was, just to kind of put into a little different perspective, is I'll tell a minor story because I really it's my dad telling the story, and I think there's nothing more powerful than listening to our parents who are giving you all these details. But a couple things. So 3 people, I'm telling you a perspective of, my aunt was the youngest in their family. I'm just not going to repeat the ghetto. They all had the same thing. They were, they were born in Lodz, Poland, and they were put in this ghetto and everything. My dad's family had a bakery that they owned. So there were a lot of stories about things that they did in their community. But my Aunt Ruth was taken it was sort of like a sister so she was together with someone. And then my dad and his brother, as David was saying, so this is what I want you to do. I really think it's important to get a thought in your own mind of kind of what would you do, right? So the first thing is that, can you imagine, you really don't know whether going to the left or going to the right, what did it mean? What was your destiny? And they were very specific, as they were saying, is that it was a constant, twice a day, 3 times a day roll call. They want to make sure no one was escaping or missing, or maybe didn't look as healthy that day, and that wasn't going to be good enough, or you couldn't keep up, and they went on. And in my dad's story too, there's a lot about, I don't know that I realized as much earlier in life, as there were multiple places that he went. So he was in Dachau as a camp, and I think Auschwitz, and then other camps that are not as maybe as well known. But it was a constant. Once the Germans knew that they were, the war was things were changing, it was like constantly just taking these people and keeping them on the move, and just like David said, if you couldn't keep up, you either just dropped dead, or you were shot, or, it was just one of those things, like, there were all these rules that nobody knew the rules, and you just it just went on and on and on. So the reason I brought it up is because, so my aunt is interviewed, Steven Spielberg really became very interested in this. So my cousin was just telling me, or my brother-in-law was telling the story, because their daughter went to USC, and when they went to visit her many years ago, there's this whole Shoah Foundation, which Steven Spielberg actually helped to create, which was interviewing as many Holocaust survivors as they could find to make a kind of a museum out of it. And they said that they happened to come across my dad. So there's about 2 hours of interviewing. So you got my aunt's version, of the story, and she was also in the camps where this Dr. Mengele was, who, by the way, was just running human experiments. And he came up with all sorts of ideas of things that he decided he wanted to investigate. And he particularly went after twins, because if he had twins, he could do different things, and he could see. It's a very uncomfortable feeling to even think about it, let alone talk about it. And just as I can only imagine, this very crazy, creepy person was sticking his hands in you, because you just didn't know what he was capable of doing. And then think about it again, because if you're the parent or you've got a sibling, you're just watching these things that were happening that you couldn't really do anything about. But if you had someone with you, it's certainly, I have a feeling that had a bit to do with a little bit of a better ratio of survival. So the third person that ironically, as I was going through everything, is in our family, there's one, because my dad passed away in November of 2019. My uncle passed away probably about 2013 or 14. My mom was born in Saginaw. So there's one aunt who was my dad's cousin, and I talked to her yesterday because she moved to Florida many years ago. She is almost 100. And I called, her daughter was down there in Florida. I just came back from Florida and her daughter was there, and I hadn't seen her mom in such a long time. And I said, Gail, I'm gonna do this thing tomorrow night. I'd love to talk to your mom once more about it, but I'm a little concerned. I don't even wanna really bring it up again. She says, I'll ask my mom. So her mom, in the meantime, she's blind essentially in her eyes. She's in a wheelchair, but she is still somewhat functional. So she called me back on a text, and she says, no, my mom wants to talk to you for sure. And it was such a wonderful conversation. In the meantime, I have on the phone, I actually just decided to read up on her story again. So again, each person has a little different story. So Auntie Mala had they all had other siblings, but she got separated because she writes it's all, all this is just not us making up a story, this is all documented. But basically what happened is, I guess she had to get her appendix removed. So she's in the hospital as these things are going on, and then she just had a feeling something was wrong. So after this, she just literally walks out of the hospital to get out of this place. Not while she's in a camp. This is like right before, between that ghetto and as the camps are starting. And her story, which makes it a little bit different, is, so she was not with anybody either. She became by herself because her sisters were taken somewhere else. But she told me yesterday, she says, one of the things that they did, they spoke fluent German. Her family spoke fluent German. So it was a benefit because a lot of times she was communicating with these Germans, and it almost was like she wasn't Jewish, she was German. And there was one particular woman, they called these capos. So these capos were like police sort of that kept everyone in line. And she said there was a German woman who was that person. And this woman took a shine to her, and she realized that this woman didn't want to be a Nazi. She was just forced to be a Nazi. So in the meantime, she would get her extra bread and extra rationings. And she actually kept a relationship up with this woman till almost like to the bitter end. But that was very risky on that other person's part. And they all acknowledged that it wasn't like there was a rationing of food on a daily basis. There could be days where there was absolutely nothing. But then they all went out and were in these labor camps, and they were doing jobs, and so there's a little bit of my dad that I want you guys to hear, because to me it really is more powerful. So the other thing is, so my dad's sister, she's taped, and they actually asked her, and I thought it was a great question. The question is, what is it that makes one survive? Right? I mean, in these horrific kind of conditions, like how could anybody survive? Which was the plan. So each of them had a little different response to that. Now my aunt's response was, I knew that I had to go looking for my brothers. I wanted to find my brothers. That's what kept me going. So that was her answer. My aunt's in her, and there's references for all these, but what she said is that there were two things. The one was that in when she got taken in to do some other work, they took her into a hospital, which was almost like a nursing assistant for a little bit of the time. And she describes this very old man who absolutely was just in a horrible state that nobody wanted to be around, nobody wanted to touch, nobody wanted to clean him up or anything, but she did. She went over and took care of she didn't know the man, she just decided it was such a sad story that she would try to help. And this man was so grateful for her help, he said, "You're gonna survive this war, you're gonna make it." And she kept that thought with her the whole time, that she was probably gonna make it. And there was that and the help of that woman, you know. And I said, "How else did you feel like you survived?" And she said, "I never told a lie. If they asked me for something, I told them what was the truth. I never tried to make a story, because if you made up a story and they found out it wasn't right, that you were done for." Okay. So what I did is I kind of wrote down what were some of the similarities and what were some of the differences. The first was, of course, that all of them were separated, but my dad had his brother, my aunt had a cousin, and my aunt did not. Okay, so looking at similarities and differences. And I told you what my aunt said about the German language. They all had the same story about being transferred in these cattle cars. And I knew there was no place to go to the bathroom, you just went to the bath, you know, you were just in there with less and less people surviving. Each of them, in their interviews, I don't know about your parents, but both my dad and my aunt, and I don't think my aunt told me last night, but they got punished for something. You know, my dad he has the story that he and his brother were in the coal mines, but my dad forgot it. They were getting ready, they had to get up, and my dad left without taking the lamp. So he knew he was going to get in big trouble if he didn't come back with the lamp. So he ran back into the mine, but it was dark and everything. And he had to wait till the next shift came so they could find him. And it turns out, he said he didn't get in trouble. His brother got in trouble. They said, "Why didn't you take care of your brother, and you should have watched after him?" So his brother got beat up. And then my dad had another story of just something else where they just literally beat him up to a pulp. And then after they do that, they expect you to go back and for 12 hours go dig some more coal. And he explains he was 70 pounds about that time. And let's see. The other, that they had absolutely no possessions. Like I've asked my dad a million times, you know, are there any pictures or anything? Nothing. Everything is just, there was nothing that they were allowed to take. So I want to just go to the stories, but there's something else I want you to see, two things. One is also that my dad and his brother were subpoenaed, I'm sure it was at least 20, 30 years ago, that one of the guards, which he actually describes as ruthless, just he beat everybody up, they got subpoenaed that they found, you know, they caught the guy in Germany and they asked my dad and my uncle to testify against him. So he says in the tape it was a very hard decision, but he felt obligated to do it. So they actually had to go through, they were taken and the trip was paid for by the German government, and they went and they had to talk about what had happened. But then my dad says in the story that they had a few little hiccups they claimed in the trial, so they said that messed up the case, and that the man ended up having Alzheimer's, and ultimately he got no punishment at all. So, but what I want you to really look at is my dad's doing this interview. These interviews were like in the 90s, and it came to my parents' house. I need you to pay attention as my dad's telling the story. I want you to just assess his affect, because his affect is different than almost everyone that I often hear interviewed. Okay?
We don't have that much time, so let's.
The thing is, I went on this, so there's 4 tapes, 30 minutes each, 2 hours of stuff. And I was trying to figure out, okay, what am I gonna share? And the funny thing is as it went on and on, it was like, there are parts here that are they're so riveting that it's almost like you don't know what not to share. But let me move up to, I think it was around 8 minutes. So give me 1 second.
The surrounding version, that was like a we stayed there for a few days, and then we were chosen, my brother and I, to go to a camp called Flossenburg.
Want me to hold the other side?
And at this Flossenburg, we came to going by train, and they dropped us off at the station. We had to walk, it was up in the mountains, and I was sure I just couldn't make it. I don't know what strength I mustered, but I did make it, and the air was very thin, because that was a mountainous area. And in Flossenburg, we stayed a while. I don't remember doing any work there, but along came some selection group and chose me to go to a new camp. So that's where I parted company with my brother. He stayed on, and I was moved onto the trucks with some other brothers. We went to this place called Obertrauming, and that is right near Nuremberg. And there was this camp. Actually, it wasn't even finished. It was just sort of a skeleton of a camp. And the day consisted there of working in the airfields. You know, the Allies would come and bomb the airfields, and what they had us do, they created these craters, and so what they had us do is fill in the craters. Okay, and in that camp, I was getting weaker and weaker, and one day on the way home from work, we walked by one of these fields with these were what, kohlrabi? No, not what are they? It looks like sugar beets, but they're not sugar beets. It was like I'm trying to think the name of this. Anyhow, what I did is I jumped out and grabbed one of these, and the prisoners sometimes, the guards sometimes allowed us to do it, but I guess I must have gotten a bad guard, so they grabbed me and they put me down there, and they were face down, and they were getting a hand shovel, the handle of a shovel, and they were beating me unmercifully. And then they said, "Aufstehen, jüdische Schwein," und some derogatory thing. I don't know how I was able to get myself up and run into the camp. And when I got in there, I was done. And some of my, the prisoners that I was with, they took care of me. They helped me up on the bunk, and I was just a bloody mess. And of course, I was unable to go. Oh, when I got into when I got back, then the camp commander there, brutal guy, they told him what happened, so he went ahead and kicked me and beat me and did all sorts of things. Remember his name? No. Don't remember his name. But, he was a beast. So I was beaten to a pulp. And the next day, I couldn't get up, and eventually they got me onto the infirmary there in Obertrauming, and we knew that anytime you get yourself in this state, you were all finished. But somehow, I guess they didn't, they helped me in some ways where I recovered sufficiently, because it was a matter of what, maybe 3 weeks down the road, that particular camp was to close, because I guess the Americans were getting close and what have you. They never told us about that, but they put all the people who were on the infirmary, and they put them on this huge truck, and I think I was probably one of the ablest in the individuals there physically, so they put me on there, on the, like on the cab of the truck, I remember, and they gave me a white flag to hang on to. I didn't know what that was all about. But the same day that happened, they took all the prisoners that could walk, and they took them on the march. And these people were slated to march all the way to Dachau. And just a handful made it. Because what happened is, as we were riding on this truck, we were riding through Munich at the time, and I had that flag in my hands, the white flag, and there were American planes. Just absolutely, I don't think there was a home left that wasn't burning in Munich. The city was an inferno, but we were driving through to get to Dachau there, and we were not even touched by any of those sorties that the American flyers were flying. And we came into Dachau, and again I had to go through the process, of cleaning up, delousing stuff and all that. And there I was there with checks and poles and all that.
So we weren't just Jewish people, it was all, anyone who wasn't of a certain,
There was in Dachau. That was still the winter of 1990 and 1945, and it was then probably was something like maybe the middle of March or toward the end of March.
I wanted to just
And I was
it's hard to see, you'd have to come close, but there's a mark on my dad's neck, it's a scar. So I was hoping at the very end he really is going to explain.
clean, given clothing, and I started. Eventually, I ended up there with a detachment of workers to work outside the camp to bury dead bodies. And we from the camp, they all got there were just hundreds of dead bodies, just skeletons.
My dad's, again, he was born in around 25 too, so he's,
We
gets into these camps probably when he's in about 5th grade,
to us that
and he's there
the
till
orders
about
of
18.
Himmler, I think, was
So how old was he when he passed away?
send
92.
charges to Dachau, blow up the camp.
So wait, this is important.
I decided to
This is important.
make a run for it. So I asked the guard if I can go to the bathroom because we were out in the wooded area, and he said yeah, and I did, and I just kept running and running and running. And eventually, I guess they caught up with me, shot, left me for dead.
That's the scar he has.
And that was in April 28, when the Patton's liberating forces came in, and I don't know how that happened that they didn't finish me off. They knew that the end was near anyhow, and I was shot right in the face here, and the bullet came through here, and I was out, unconscious, and I guess I was picked up within no time whatsoever by the American liberating forces, and I ended up 3 days later in an American field hospital, alive. So that was the side of the camps, and that was Patton's right, who liberated me. And
Pretty close to the end of my time.
The prison, there are just so many people who died right there and then.
After the whole thing, that they had
The
survived it to
starvation
death.
was so immense, and then the dysentery and typhoid fever and all that was rampant. So and also some individuals, when the American liberating forces came in, I guess the food was just maybe too rich for them. So sent me to this, I think it was in Augsburg, which is right near Dachau. It was like a convalescent place for people who really were more dead than alive, so forth. You know, it can't be managed.
I can stop it. I mean, there's more, but at any rate, so then, oops, sorry. So then my dad ends up going back to my aunt. So my aunt, they all get liberty. They all are freed. And my aunt says in her tape that she, and I got her plugged in over here, but anyway, she got word that a brother was alive. She didn't know one brother was alive, they knew. And what she was doing is she heard that he was alive, so she went back to her home in Lodz, where they actually grew up, and there was nobody there. In fact, people had moved into their home.
Communism.
So she says that she stayed there for a couple of days or nights or whatever, because she, the other thing you have to also realize is, besides everything that was taken from everyone, that are all these people who were survivors, is, so now it's over, but they have absolutely nothing. They have no money. They're lucky if they have a family member, or then who do you still trust? Or where are you going to find yourself going, because your homeland is really not your homeland anymore. So as my dad tells later in the story, so he and his brother, they end up finding each other because someone on the street, there were lists that they would write names that were the survivors. So they would go to the lists and see if they had a relative who was alive. And when my aunt found that out, so she went. So then she heard that both brothers were alive and they were in this other place. And while my dad says they were walking, he actually says on the tape, somebody says, your sister's alive, and we just saw her down the street, and they reunited as 3 orphans who were there was an orphanage that they actually had formed to help the children, and they had some family members that were in Michigan. So now, in the end of, to me, the story, so I don't know, I picked a small segment that maybe wasn't even the best segment of what I could have picked, but the one thing that really stands out to me about my dad is the fact that there's nothing bitter in anything he ever says or does. Granted, he would talk about some bad situations and what happened to him, and occasionally, he would make a comment about, something about the meal, and, we barely had a potato, every 5, just that they would eat dirt because there wasn't anything.
They'd eat grass.
It was one of these things that, as we're talking about, like, how angry could you be? How some people were affected by this as post-traumatic stress disorder to really never recover, which makes a lot of sense. I mean, to be treated and what they saw, again, you can imagine if you're 8 years old, 10 years old, 12 years old, or watching what was happening. It's amazing, but that's the one character of my father that made him the most unique person. And then he came here and he went and talked to groups, and he talked to church groups, and he talked to Jewish groups, and so I just have to tell you when you are motivated and inspired, and you aspire to something, where you find yourself not ever thinking you can't do something. My dad came, they spoke no English, they had to find some jobs.
He speaks beautiful English.
He's got, yeah.
Wow.
So this is the thing, so all of a sudden, can you imagine you're in 4th grade, and then the next time you're in any formal education, you come and you're supposed to be in 12th grade, right? So he says what they did is they sent them to a school where they had 4 weeks of English. And the woman decided that he was good enough to go on to get into high school, to enroll into the high school. And so he went in Detroit. And so he finishes he gets a certificate, and then he decides he wants to go to Wayne State. So he gets his teaching certificate, And ultimately, he ends up getting his master's, and then he ended up getting his PhD in social science. He taught for 6th grade for like 35 years. And he ended up supervising student teachers at U of M Dearborn for 10 years. That was sort of the end of his career.
Marcia, I hate to cut you
Yeah.
off, but we're way past time. I just want to open it up, I just want to open up if anybody has any questions before we're done today.
Well, I have a comment.
Go ahead.
It's really just thank you, because I think maybe Sally and David picked this date in October. So just to prepare something like this, you know, that's nuggets for us to even begin to digest. And then you have reams and lifetimes to consolidate into an hour and a half is remarkable. And I already know how much effort you put into it, because I happen to call a few times when people are planning. I just want to acknowledge that, because it's incredible, and to communicate to us with so much emotion, I know, in your lives and your losses and their losses. So the effort, thank you for the effort.
Thank you.
and the
One of
time.
the things I have to say, my mother is a lot like your father. Always happy, always smiling, because she's so happy to be alive. She's so happy to breathe. She said in one of her tapes, I didn't play it, but she said that she takes a deep breath and she touches herself and says to herself, I am alive, I'm alive. Because what the Nazis said to them when they went to Bergen-Belsen, that if they lost the war, they were gonna kill every one of them. And so they were looking at death every day. So my mother, to this day, at her ripe age, I think of 99, I said, Mom, doesn't life suck? Don't you wanna, you still wanna go on? She goes, yes, being alive, that's all I ever wanted. Yeah, you know,
It's
so,
good that they could overcome it, because my in-laws were survivors,
I know.
and they lived the trauma of the war every single day of their
I
lives,
know.
even as they were.
Meanwhile, I'm gonna ask Don if he wants to make a comment, because he was very close to Holocaust survivors, he worked for them.
No, I probably couldn't do it without crying, really.
Really? They were like your heart, so I'm not gonna put you on the spot then.
There's apparently new technology, from what I understand, and someone devised now these holograms.
I saw that.
Yeah, and they're taking the survivors they got before they had passed, and they do something digitally so that you can almost ask them any question, and you can almost
You can ask them.
That was on
questions and they
60
will
Minutes.
respond.
Yeah, 60 minutes, yeah.
I have the thing for it, I can send it to you. Anybody have a comment, or anybody wanna say
You guys were
something?
great, thank you.
Yeah.
Before we
Wait,
start?
before we
Wait,
start,
wait,
hold
David.
on, I just want to thank Allegra, she brought some books over, she was very instrumental in also helping me out and getting a better understanding. And she has a book on why some people have the numbers on their arms and not. It's a really good book. I know it's for kids, but I think adults would get a lot
Yeah,
out
it
of it.
really says it really kind of simple, but very well done.
Very plain, right?
It's a
And
new
then
book.
there's, you want to tell them about the other book, the thick one? Or?
It's a new book, and it just chronically gives you the whole war, and from the beginning to the end. But it's a beautifully done book. It's very detailed. It's just I got it from the Holocaust Museum. It's a new book that's out.
You know,
I
when,
try to get every book I can, because my parents were survivors.
but you know, when we look at Ukraine today,
It's interesting.
and then we look at that, did we ever think there would be a diabolical person like that
When
again,
I-
that would be torturing and
Well,
killing people?
when I look at Ukraine and I saw the ditches that they did,
I saw that.
because my father's first wife and his son, that's how they perished.
Mm-hmm.
So it just,
Except,
it's just so sad and
And you know,
sad,
they
so
made the
makes me-
survivors do those ditches.
Right, yeah.
My mother said she had to
Yeah.
do those ditches.
So it brings back, it kind of brings it to your face, all the things your parents talked about, and
But I never thought I'd see it in our
no, I
lifetime.
never did either.
it just questions why we aren't involved, and I know we don't want World War III, but I don't know. It's
Anyway, with that happy note.
I just
Yeah, I'm
wanted to
sorry.
say, you know, for another perspective on all this, I saw advertised on TV that Ken Burns